Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 essential symphonies for classical music beginners. These are pieces that will really help you sort of get into the world of classical music that you really should know and have a chance to absorb. And I have a few preliminary remarks, and then I'll give you the list. Or you could look at it because it's right below this video in the description at any point. First of all, why symphonies? Symphonies are the highest form of orchestral music yet invented. And so when most people get into classical music, they tend to know that there's something called a symphony and that this symphony is important and they should sort of know what they are. So we're starting with symphonies. Second, what is a symphony? Well, a symphony is a work for orchestra in a particular form, and the form is called sonata form, which you don't have to really know anything about at this point, but I did do a video called Sonata Form Unpacked, which you can certainly watch with musical examples and everything that might help you explain what it is and what's going on. But the point of a symphony is that it usually consists of several chunks of music. Those chunks are called movements. They're not songs. They are movements. They are the parts of a larger work. In the classical music world, the parts of a larger work are called movements. It's very simple. And the word movement is actually rather telling because it suggests something happening, doesn't it? That there is a journey or a progress happening. And that's what happens in symphonies. That progress might be programmatic. In other words, it might tell a story. It might tell a story that the composer wanted to express, which he tells us in advance. It might be something that you imagine as you listen, or it could be a purely emotional progression. That is a sequence of moods of differing types: happiness, sadness, joking, nostalgia, bitterness, anything in between. And again, these are moods that you will describe as the music strikes you. But the point is that all four parts, or if it's in one gigantic movement, which sometimes happens, the interior divisions of multiple sections, they all add up to a satisfying, fulfilling, coherent package. You get the whole enchilada in those four movements. And that's what makes a symphony. And the way that composers design the symphony so that you hear this sort of fulfilling, coherent progression of moods, and at the end go, oh yeah, that was terrific. Let's listen to it again. There's a million ways that they can do that. Just countless ways. And I describe those in many other videos on this channel. But at this point, I want to make just one other major point before we talk about the music. And that's this, that because symphonies and other works are in large forms, that is, the forms of the music, they're not 3-minute long songs or tiny little sniglets. They're big. They take time. That means you have to take time. And so if you're somebody who's interested in getting into classical music, you have to simply accept the fact, not that you don't have knowledge or that you're not equipped. That's nonsense. The music tells you what you need to know while you listen to it. You don't need any other really serious special information other than, things like this that point you in the direction of what to listen to. But how to listen to it, you know what to do. You sit and you listen. Are you willing to do that? That's the real catch. Because today, in our current busy lives and our oversaturation with multimedia productions, we no longer really believe that our ears are all we need. That it's okay to sit down for half an hour, keep our hands at our sides, put the book down, and just listen. Just absorb information through our sense of hearing, nonverbal information. And that's a big reach for a lot of people. And I think you really, you either sort of accept that premise or you don't. And if you don't, that doesn't mean that classical music isn't for you, but that means it's mostly going to be background music to other activities. But if you want to pay attention to it, if you want to get the full story from these these journeys, these musical novels, which are symphonies, then you got to sit down and pay attention and take the time. And there isn't any way around that. But I can guarantee you that if you do sit down and take the time, it will be a marvelous, marvelous experience as soon as you get used to doing that, because the music is amazing. And it's music that you can't hear any other way, that you can't encounter any other way. This is a whole different world of what music can be. And the difference between classical music and popular music, I've said this many times in other videos, which you may have a chance to look at if you're so inclined. The difference is not a question of, rock and roll versus classical, or a stylistic difference. It's a formal difference. It's a question of size. It's a question of time. It's a question of understanding some of the other things that music can be, aside from just a song or a dance or an accompaniment to a movie or something like that, because music has its own structures. It's just like knowing, the difference between, a matchbox car, a little toy truck, and the actual 18-wheeler, or between, I said before, we see these TV shows with tiny houses and a mansion. They're all buildings. They're all vehicles, but there are many, many different types of them. And no one mistakes one for the other. Nobody mistakes a tricycle for a jet, a jet plane. I mean, one is a tricycle, one is a jet plane. One is bigger than the other. One is more sophisticated than the other. One is more complex than the other. So it is with music. There are many different sizes, shapes, forms, and types of music that are differentiated not so much by the style in which they're written, but by the fact that they are different size structures. And so when you get to know classical music, one of the things that you really need to know, one of the most important things, is what those structures are, and a symphony is one of them. So with that said, and with the time element and the size element sort of taken into consideration, let's go through the list, shall we? The 10 essential symphonies. And by essential, I mean these will really give you a good grounding in what symphonies are and what they can be. Most of them are written by very famous composers. They're not always their most famous symphonies, but they are, I think, the ones that are the most typical, or among the most typical of their composers, or at least have a reason for you listening to them first, rather than later on in your explorations. But once you know what these are, you can go crazy and just follow your interest. And we begin with the father of the symphony, Joseph Haydn. Now, Haydn lived from around the 1730s to 1809-ish, and he essentially invented the symphony. That doesn't mean there weren't lots of composers writing lots of symphonies. There were. But Haydn was indisputably the best at it, and he was the person who made the symphony an important orchestral statement, one that was so important that other composers who came later, such as Mozart and Beethoven, and all the way up to Tchaikovsky and Brahms and, names that you probably know, they could make the symphony the major form of orchestral music. It was Haydn who did that first. And some would say he did it best. He certainly did it amazingly. Actually, the best business isn't necessary. We never have to say one composer is great to say that another one is less great if they were both geniuses. They're great in their own way. And we should leave it at that. So for Haydn wrote 107 symphonies. Of all the major composers who wrote symphonies, Haydn wrote the most. There were other composers who wrote more, but we don't care about them. Haydn we care about, which means that the fact that he wrote so many of them is a real issue, because where do you start and how do you get into it? And these symphonies trace the history of the form from something light and entertaining and diverting and not so important to something bigger and grander and longer and more sophisticated and enormously important. And so we have to start with one of his later ones. And the one I've chosen is his Symphony number 88. And the reason I chose it, well, there are two reasons. One is because it's just, in many ways, it exemplifies what a symphony should be in the classical period. That is the period from around from around 1760 to the death of Beethoven in the late 1820s. That was the classical period. And the classical symphony had as its goal enormous elegance, tunefulness, sophistication, and a wide range of emotion, of course, but all expressed within a particularly fine sense of form and balance and proportion. And this symphony has those things. It's not terribly long. It's only about 25 minutes, 22 minutes, something like that. And it has 4 movements, 4 sections, which follow the usual pattern for a symphony, which is quick, slow, dance, and zippy finale. That's the normal form. Sometimes the inner ones, the slow and the dance, can get switched around, but normally that's what you get. That's what you get in the symphony. And these 4 sections give you the opportunity to do, well, just about anything you want in terms of emotional expression. So, number 88. Oh, wow, what a great symphony this is. It has so many fabulous features. It's almost impossible to describe them all, but I'm going to just settle on one very, very simple one. It's the number 4. One of the things that we're not used to thinking about when we listen to music that really matters in classical music is what we call phrasing, the form of a melody, the way tunes are put together. And the opening of this symphony, well, there's a slow introduction, and then you get the actual first tune. And that first tune is dun da 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 dum. Let me do it right. Bum bum ba da 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 bum 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 ba da dum ba da dum. Very simple, almost childlike, almost like a nursery rhyme. But did you notice it had four phrases, like a sentence with commas between them? There's bum bum ba da 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 dum da 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 dum bum 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 ba da dum ba da dum. That's it. And one of the things that you'll notice is that every single main theme of every single movement in this symphony also has 4 phrases. In the slow movement, which is just gorgeous, the main theme is for an oboe with a solo cello playing the same time in unison together, making an entirely new sound. And the theme is da da hem. Four pieces. And then you have a minuet, which is a dance, a rather courtly dance, except in Haydn's hands it's often rather rustic and countrified. And it goes yum ba dum bum ba dum ba dum bum ba dum ba dum bum ba dum ba bum 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 ba da dum. 4 bits. And then you have a finale. And the finale's got one of the catchiest tunes in the world. It's unbelievably zippy. And it goes da 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 ba da da dum bum 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 ba da 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 dum bum 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 ba da 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 dum bum 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 ba da da dum. 4 phrases. So if you can count to 4, you'll know what happens with Haydn's 88th Symphony. And it's really that simple. And I'm not saying that to dumb down the work. The point I want to make about this is not that, it's all based on like something silly or stupid. Rather, that Haydn uses this basic construction to unify all 4 movements of the symphony. This is how you know when it's over that you've heard Symphony number 88 and nothing else, and nothing that could be from anything else. And it gives you, whether you notice it or not, this unconscious feeling of great satisfaction. You just go, that was wonderful. It all fit together so well. I feel so satisfied because those four-piece themes or tunes express a whole different range of emotions. I mean, that's the point, right? I mean, the dance is grand and somewhat elegant. That slow movement is beautiful and heartfelt and lyrical. The first movement is kind of rustic and countrified sounding. The last movement is just sort of fun and wacky and whistleable tunefulness. All of the different expression is created by variations on one simple idea. And so, in one sense, classical music is much less complicated than you think it may be. In the other sense, it's incredibly sophisticated because what composers have the resources to do with their material is endless. They can make the music say anything. And so Haydn's 88th Symphony is a wonderful place to get started. I'm not going to talk about any of the other works at this length. Don't worry. But I wanted to sort of set you off on the right path with a sense of what to listen to and how to listen. Things to think about while you're listening. Does something sound like another thing? Have you heard something before? Does something in that last movement recall something you heard in a previous movement? In order to make those connections, you have to know the music, which means you have to spend the time. So it always comes back to time. So number 2, Mozart, his Symphony in G minor, number 40. Now, if you look at the list, you'll see that it says Mozart Symphony number 40, K550. Well, the K stands for Kerschel. Kerschel is the man who put together the catalog of Mozart's music because Mozart, as you may know, died very, very young. He was only in his mid-30s when he died, and most of his music wasn't published, and it wasn't organized, and someone had to do it. So in the world of classical music, when somebody does that, they usually get a catalog named after them, and it helps to identify certain works of very prolific composers. So if you see K numbers, you will know what that is. Other composers who did publish their stuff or did take the time and trouble often had opus numbers, which just means work number 7 or whatever it is. They gave their works their own numbers so that people could tell what they are. And the classical music world is a confusing mixture of both of these. You've got individual cataloging systems, and you have the composer's own, or you have the publishers, and you just have to figure it out. That's why we call it Symphony number 40. So nobody has to worry about any of the other stuff. But if you see that stuff, that's what it means. It's just a catalog number, a way of identifying the work in question. And so I just thought you'd want to know that. That's a helpful little tidbit to know. I mean, Haydn, for example, who wrote so much music, he has several catalogs. He has Hoboken, he has Landon, he has, there's another critical edition, a complete edition in the works. Don't worry about it. Go by the nickname, go by the simplest number, the least amount of information. Now, Mozart's Symphony number 40 is another unbelievably famous symphony and another iconic work in the history of the classical symphony. You probably know the main tune. Da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-da, da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba, ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba. It's just beautiful. And that's Mozart. That's what you need to know about Mozart. Mozart was the vocal music composer par excellence. His music is about singing. It's about the human voice. It's about breathing and phrasing in the way that a great singer would sing a great song or tune. All of Mozart's music has that quality. And to a degree that no other composer really matched. Musical ideas can consist of many things besides tunes. There are all kinds of things music can do that is not a tune or is not a singable tune. But Mozart's main material and his main objective, even in his music without words, was to create beautiful singing melodies that express human emotion. And the emotion that we hear in the opening of this symphony, because it's in a minor key, a darker key, a more just unhappy key, you might want to call it in the crudest sense, is pathos. Pathos and an elegant, nostalgic, sometimes heartbreaking amount of pathos. And, it's all you need to say about it. I just need to turn you loose with one piece of information, and that's this. Classical symphonies particularly are full of repeats. That is, you hear the first part of a movement and then you go back and you repeat it. The reason to do that is, first of all, to enlarge the form, to make it take longer and be bigger. Because if you're going to get a bunch of people and pay them to play a symphony, and you've got dozens of them, you might as well give them something to do. And the other reason is because it's better to get to know the tunes, to know the themes, so that you can better hear what the composer is going to do with them later and get them into your head. Now, the slow movement of this symphony has the usual repeats. That is, the first half of the movement is repeated, and the second half of the movement is repeated. If that happens, it's going to be a very long movement. I mean, it can stretch out to 12, 15 minutes in some performances. Take a look at timings and track listings. Do not listen to recordings that have all the repeats in the slow movement. It is lethal. It really is. You may wonder if it's going to be lethal. Why do composers do it? Well, again, partly it was practicality. There were reasons of form and conventions of the day, and to get people, give people the opportunity to get to know it. But I really believe that for modern listeners, with our attention spans and our expectations, to hear huge sectional repeats such as those that you find in the second movement, the slow movement of Mozart's 40th Symphony, it really gets to be too much. And so I do not recommend that you listen initially to a performance with all the repeats. After that, if you're curious about what it sounds like when it takes twice as long, then give it a shot. If you love it that much that you really want to hear it twice like that, then knock yourself out. It's perfectly fine. I'm not saying it's good or it's bad, but I'm talking about as an initial experience of the work. The fewer repeats in slow movements, the better off you'll be. So that's Mozart. Next, we move on to Beethoven. Now, of course, Beethoven wrote Beethoven's Fifth, the most famous piece of classical music in the world. And the funny thing about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is that once people recognize Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and that opening, since everyone knows it, no one bothers to listen to the rest of the symphony. It has 3 more movements. And it follows this fabulous emotional trajectory from tragedy, from anger, from rage, to just extreme triumph and ecstasy and happiness and victory. And oh my God, it's nuts. And that's not the symphony I chose. I chose the next one, the one that he wrote at the same time as a pair, which makes it really interesting to compare them if you get a chance. His 6th symphony, the Pastoral Symphony. Now, this symphony is a programmatic symphony. Program simply means it has a story. It's a program. It has a plot. In this case, the plot is pastoralness. It's countryside. It's what happens out in the rural world. So you've got happy feelings on arriving in the country. Then you have a lovely scene by the brook. You don't know what's happening in the scene, but there's a brook. You can hear it. You hear it going. There's a brook. And then you've got a peasant celebration, happy dance music, and that's your dance movement that we've already seen. Then there is an interpolation, a 4th movement leading to a 5th movement, and the last 3 are all attached. They play continuously. There's a thunderstorm. You're out in nature. It's a big thunderstorm, a really good storm, too. It's very effective, and you'll know exactly what it is. And finally, a song of thanksgiving to the deity after the storm, with a shepherd piping in the background. Do, 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 da, dum, bum, 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 bum. And it's gorgeous. Oh, this music is so beautiful. But more to the point, I chose this because this was one of the pieces that blew my mind when I was like 6 years old and first getting into classical music. And I've told this story many times, but it was my mother's record collection that did it. She had Beethoven's 6th Symphony, the Pastoral, and the album cover was Bruegel's The Harvesters. If you don't know Bruegel's The Harvesters, you can Google it. Bruegel was one of the great Dutch painters, and The Harvesters is a famous painting. You may have seen it of a wheat field with wheat gathered in sheaves, and they're sort of mowing through it, and there are little kids running around, and peasants dressed up in peasant outfits as they did those. There's lots of colorful clothing, and they're harvesting. And I looked at the cover, and I said to my mother, as I was 6, I hadn't even learned how to read yet. I said, "What is this word?" And she said, pastoral, it means countryside. Just listen to the music and look at the painting. Look at the cover. And I did. And it hit me. And it will hit you. I guarantee it. Because the music is so specific, as to its subject. You cannot listen to this music without thinking about the countryside and nature and birds and all of that stuff. But exactly what these specific parts mean when, well, that's different for everybody. Because Beethoven says that the music was more the expression of feelings than painting. Although there's a good bit of painting, too. That storm is a painting. I mean, you can't mistake it for anything else. And the scene by the brook, that's a painting. But essentially, it's the feelings that these pictures or moods or whatever they are, the feelings that the music evokes in us that gives it that pastoral quality. And so when you listen to it, I would ask you to simply ask yourself, why do we react the way we do? What is it that we've heard before? What buttons is this music pushing that create the right effect that Beethoven intended? That's what's so fascinating, because we are hardwired as listeners to understand this music. That's really a point that I want to make very, very forcefully. It doesn't take any special anything. You are built to hear this music and respond to it. And you will, whether you want to or not. Now, you may not be thrilled by all of it. There may be parts you like better than others. The slow movement, that's tricky. If the performance isn't zippy enough, it can be quite dull. There are tricks to it. There's no question about that. But essentially, you are designed to accept and respond to the message that this music is conveying to you. And so I chose this symphony because we know what the message is, first of all. And second of all, because it's a wonderful way for you to interrogate yourself while you're listening and analyze your own response to music, just to see how receptive you are. And once you know that, you'll know how much work you have to do if you really want to get into classical music, if you love it and if you find it intriguing, and, how far you get with it. And there is no right or wrong answer to that question. You are who you are. And that's that. So Beethoven's Symphony No. 6. Next, Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony, Symphony No. 3. Now, the Scottish Symphony is a bit like Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. It has a nickname. The nickname comes from the fact that Mendelssohn thought the music was evocative of his travels in Scotland, and perhaps a little bit of Scottish music as well. The opening theme, do 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 do. It's so beautiful, but it also has that sort of, you might call it a Scottish quality. Maybe you won't. The second movement particularly, which, by the way, is based on exactly the same tune, only speeded up. I mean, it's one of the fascinating things about this symphony is that the various movements share themes. That is called cyclical form in the music biz, when tunes from one movement pop up in later movements. It doesn't always happen, and there are many ways to unify works that do not involve sharing actual long tunes. But in the Romantic period, which started sort of after Beethoven died, say around 1830 to whenever, 19-something, early 19s, the Romantic period used that very frequently as a unifying force in large pieces of music. So Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony is one of the earliest symphonies to do that very, very extensively. And it is a brilliant, brilliant work that had a huge influence on tons of music that came later, while being absolutely fabulous all by itself. And its moodiness, its lyricism, the finale is marked Allegro Guerrerico, or warlike Allegro, and it's supposed to be martial. It's the Scottish clans riding into battle. It's galloping like that. So it's totally cool. and I think you'll enjoy it very, very much. Then we have Saint-Saens. Now, who was Saint-Saens? Well, first of all, obviously, he was not German. He was French. And I chose this symphony simply because it's a real test of your audio system. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, right? One of the things that makes classical music so fabulous, especially classical orchestral music, is that it's orchestral. It's that it challenges your sound system. It sounds thrilling. I mean, the orchestra, the symphony orchestra, is one of the all-time greatest inventions in the history of Western civilization. Let's just talk tachlis, as we say in Yiddish. Let's tell it like it is. It's just an unbelievable, unbelievable thing. And exploiting that thing to the outermost limits of its capabilities is just so glorious. Oh my God, what could be more fun than that? To just wallow in the fabulous sounds that you make. And Saint-Saëns' Third Symphony not only has a full symphony orchestra, it has a piano part in the middle of it and a huge organ part, especially in the slow movement and finale, when the organ comes cranking in for the very first time with its full force to oppose the orchestra. And it is sonically one of the most glorious things in the history of humanity. And that's all I need to say about it, because there is nothing wrong, nothing with just listening to something to be overwhelmed by the sonic splendor of it. And Saint-Saëns' Third Symphony is definitely one of those pieces. It is also a symphony in cyclical form. It has two movements, actually, which contain two parts, each attached. So there's a fast movement and a slow movement, but they're attached. And then a dance called a scherzo, which means joke, actually. But it's a dance movement, like a minuet. And then a finale, which are attached. And so even the form is interesting. But let's not kid ourselves. People don't listen to the symphony because they like the form. They listen to it because they want to hear the organ and the orchestra cranking at full tilt. And wow, what an experience that is. So yeah, go for it. Next, Brahms, Symphony No. 4. Now, when most people talk about Brahms, they usually talk about the first two symphonies, because the first symphony is written clearly in the image of Beethoven's Fifth. That is, it follows a tragedy to triumph emotional trajectory. And the second is a predominantly lyrical work with almost a pastoral quality, quite similar to what Beethoven did in pairing his Fifth and Sixth Symphonies composed at about the same time, which is exactly what happened with Brahms. But that's not the one I chose. I chose the fourth, which is a more, I think, Brahmsy work. It's very, very unique. First of all, it's a tragic symphony. It ends in great turmoil. And second of all, it has a very, very interesting progression of moods. Beautiful. The first movement is this windswept, destiny-laden exordium. The second movement is sort of legendary, bardic storytelling quality. The third movement is supposedly the dance, or scherzo, or minuet, or whatever you would like to call it, but it's not dance-like at all. It's a exuberant celebration in very, very strict form, full of energy and vigor, but it's not a dance. It's a different thing. And the reason for that is because the finale is something called a Passacaglia, which means to go through the street in Spanish. But the Passacaglia, or Passacaglia in Spanish, Passacaglia is Italian, means the same thing, is an old dance form in which you have variations of a theme with an underlying bass line, a bass part that gets repeated over and over and over again, over which and just about anything can happen. And the bass theme is da, 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 bom, bom. Those 8 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, that's it. 8 notes. And those are below every single variation. Now, I mean, composers can stretch them out. They can hide them. It doesn't sound like, you know, this sort of boring, plodding, same repeated bass thing over and over again forever, but it's there. And what makes this symphony so marvelous is that unique emotional progression from this despairing opening or angry opening, whatever it is, to the lyrical, beautiful slow movement, to that ferociously exciting third movement, to this gripping, tragic, implacable, fate-laden, doom-laden finale. And oh, it's so cool. And really, it's unique in the history of symphonic composition. And it's the essence in some ways of what Brahms was. Well, he was a profound traditionalist on the one hand, but he used traditional ideas and references to his great classical forebearers in a completely personal, powerful, and unique way. So that's why I picked Brahms fourth. Go for it. Oh my goodness, it's fun. After that, Tchaikovsky, Symphony No. 5. Now, Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony is probably, it's one of the most popular symphonies in the Romantic repertoire. It has tunes that are gorgeous. Tchaikovsky wrote the most gorgeous, emotionally laden, fabulous themes. Oh my God. And this symphony is full of them. Now, this symphony has a motto theme that appears at the very beginning, and it shows up as an introduction. Do, 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 do. It's like that. And it shows up in every movement, finally transformed into a triumphant, victorious march. The emotional progression in this symphony is similar to that of Brahms' first or Beethoven's fifth, that tragedy to triumph emotional trajectory. But because Tchaikovsky is Tchaikovsky, the melodic and lyrical passion along the way is just like, oh my God, it's just so beautiful. It really is just one of those things. Tchaikovsky himself, like he was with most of his music, wasn't happy with it. He thought the finale sounded artificial. And most people have not cared a whit. Everyone just gets on their feet at the end and gives it a standing ovation. And you probably will too. The fun thing is that it's very easy to follow this motto as it appears very, very clearly in each movement, transformed from its original sort of doldrums into a triumphant statement of unassailable, victorious stuff. It's just great. And along the way, oh, the melodies. Melody after melody after melody of just unbelievable, fabulous emotional intensity. Quite the piece. Really is. And we've moved up. Basically, I don't know if you've noticed this, but this list is kind of chronological. I mean, maybe not 100%, but it's close. It's very close. So we're going from the classical period through the Romantic period. And at the end of the Romantic period, we're going to sort of take a pause. Late Romantic period, early modern period. And that's where we'll end. So after Tchaikovsky, we talk about Dvorak, his New World Symphony, his most popular symphony. I have to say, this was a tough pick. This was a very tough pick for me because Dvorak is one of the most underrated composers in all of classical music. He was probably the greatest composer in the second half of the 19th century, if by that we mean the most versatile. He did everything. He wrote operas. He wrote chamber music. He wrote orchestral music. He wrote choral music. And he was great at all of it. But because he was a little guy from a little country, Czechoslovakia, the Czech lands, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, a province, he doesn't get much attention. And because he wasn't German, and because German music controlled everything that happened in Central Europe. So that meant that our own view, and this is really worth stressing, our own view of what great music is, was actually the result of the German nationalist invention of the academic profession of musicology. Our view of the great works is essentially a Germanic view. And I think that's wrong. I don't think you should think about it for a minute. I don't think you need to take it with anything but a huge grain of salt and like what you like, whatever you want. And the thing about Dvorak is that his most popular symphony is the New World Symphony, the Ninth Symphony. But he wrote 9 symphonies in all, 6 of which are unquestionable masterpieces, and I could have picked any of them. They are glorious, glorious works. And so I do hope you'll explore the others. But the 9th is simply phenomenal. I mean, we all love it because it is also a symphony in serious cyclical form with a motto theme that appears in all 4 movements. It has a finale that recalls all of the themes from all of the other movements. It's an example of what Dvorak thought American composers could do if they used native melodic inspiration, that is, African American and Native American musical objects. And that has caused no end of hysteria. It's really horrible what's happened, actually, in the whole discourse on that, because in Dvorak's day, everybody was offended that he suggested using Negro spirituals or American Indian music. They even thought that was terrible, that they were primitive and unworthy of integration into the grand European white, culture thing. And that was considered to be shocking that Dvorak suggested that. Today, people will say Dvorak was, a cultural appropriator, that he took music and things that didn't belong to him and he whiteified them somehow. I mean, it's just as bad. It's only the other angle. It's just like, whether you go left or right, it's crazy. It doesn't matter how far. It's the extremities that make it so loopy. But this is an incredibly beautiful work, one full of tunes. The second movement has a theme that was actually turned into a quasi-Negro spiritual called Going Home, but it was Dvorak who wrote the tune, and you're going to love it. It's absolutely marvelous. After Dvorak, we're going in a whole different range. Mahler, Symphony No. 2, The Resurrection. Well, that's a modest title, isn't it? And you should gather from that it's called that because it's about a spiritual journey, a journey from death to rebirth. And wow, Mahler pulls out all the stops in this one. The whole thing plays for about an hour and 20 minutes in most performances. It has a chorus at the end singing about the resurrection. It has a song in the middle of it, sung by a mezzo-soprano. It's just got everything but the kitchen sink. And that's what Mahler was about. Mahler said the symphony must be the world. It must express everything. And so to that end, he created works that are huge and that use elements from popular music, from folk song, from the classical tradition, from original stuff that he dreamt up, all scored for a 120-piece orchestra with offstage brass bands and singers. And oh my God, it's, if you really want to go for broke, you listen to Mahler and you start with the Second Symphony because it will blow you away. Guaranteed. It's an astonishing piece of music. However, we got to end somewhere. And we're going to end with Sibelius's Symphony No. 2. Now, the Sibelius Symphony No. 2 is part of a group of symphonies that we've talked about already. One was the Tchaikovsky Fifth. One was the Dvorak New World Symphony. These were composers who we call romantic nationalists. That is, they were steeped in the folk music of their own country, the melodic inspiration that they gained from the music of non-traditional peoples in Europe or elsewhere. It doesn't matter where. And one of the weird things about our musical tradition is that we're taught that music came in discrete periods, the Baroque period, the classical period, the Romantic period, the modern period, the postmodern period, the uber postmodern period, doesn't matter. That's not the way it worked. The way it worked was that each region or country or composer, had its own pace of development. And so romantic nationalism is an idea, a concept that still goes on. I mean, it happened late in the 20th century in South America, where the classical music tradition, that is of orchestras and composers using these themes to create music in traditional Western European forms, happened after 1950 or around there. So, the idea of things being a particular period doesn't really matter. But the fascinating thing about Sibelius is that although he was a romantic nationalist, Sibelius invented all of his folk music. He never really used any. He came up with his own concept of a mythological Finnish folk tradition based primarily on the national epic poem, the Kalevala, which was also invented by somebody. a guy named Elias Lönnrot in the 1840s and 50s in that area. Finland is a country whose nationalist tradition was completely self-willed. In other words, it was a province of Russia. It was a province of Sweden. When it finally gained its independence in the early decades of the 20th century, there was a nebulous body of sort of nationalist stuff around. But the composer who crystallized Finnish national feeling in music was Sibelius. But it was all him. It was all him. That's what makes him, I think, such a fascinating character. And Finland, such a fascinating country, by the way, because it's true of its literature. It's true of many things, of the way that it revived the Finnish language. It was a deliberately created nationalism in music. And the Second Symphony is Sibelius's most popular. I think there are other symphonies he wrote that are personally, that I think are greater in terms of, musically greater. The Fifth, the Fourth, which is grim beyond belief. It's scary. And, the one movement Seventh, which is a whole new concept in symphonic construction. But his Second Symphony is enormously characteristic. And one of the most wonderful things about it is that it's all based on a very simple melodic cell, which we hear right at the very beginning. Da 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 ba da 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 da. Well, all you need to remember is da da dum ba bum bum. Remember that? Because when you get to the finale, it goes do 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 do. He just turns it upside down. And this lovely lilting pastoral theme becomes this heroic, triumphant exordium. It's really very, very cool. But there's also lots of that kind of dark, primal, barbarian music that Sibelius created that was symbolic of early Finnishness, which never really existed. It's just amazing. It really is amazing. And so that's how I want to wrap it up, with these 10 symphonies that will give you a wonderful overview of what symphonies are, what they can be, what composers you may want to explore. But the time is yours to contribute. And I want to close with that because I can't stress it. I can't stress it enough. You have to take the time. And if you do, you're going to be rewarded a millionfold. I guarantee that too. So keep on listening, my friends. Thank you so much for joining me for this first of many talks on the basics, the essentials. I hope this has given you some ideas and some inspiration and impetus. Take care.